Nice. It's wonderful to see that we got a lot of new faces here. People who are first time here at the labs, welcome. For those who don't know about us, we're Pivotal Software. Pivotal Labs, and we're a software consultancy that we help our clients to build software products and bring in agile software development practices. And every Tuesday, we have our tech talk on various subjects, and you're welcome to go to our meetup page and find any of our upcoming events. Today, we're very happy to have Dan Berling. He is the VP of Experience Research at MadPow, which is a local design and marketing agency. Today, he's going to tell us about how to use your voice mindness in your user research. Let's welcome Dan Berling.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Cool. I can hear myself. You must be able to. So hi, my name is Dan Berlin. I am Vice President of Experience Research at MadPow. We're an experience design agency based in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But I run the research team out of the Boston office. We have about 35 people in each of the offices. And today I'm here to talk about voice mindfulness and using your psychologist voice in order to get the best data out of your users to inform design. So the things we're going to be talking about, first off, moderating qualitative research. That's what this is all about, qualitative research. We're not going asking scales. This is all about talking to people and getting information out of people that will help inform designs via that qualitative research. We'll talk about the components of your voice and how those should be modulated based on your psychologist voice. Then I'll give you a little story as to where I learned about the psychologist voice. We'll go into nonverbal communication a little bit, and at the end, we'll talk about voice mindfulness. What I mean by that, you'll learn. But we can take this out of the lab and really help ourselves have better interactions with everyone that we talk to by being more mindful of how we use our voice. So first off, a little bit about me. Hi, my name is Dan Berlin. I started off getting a BA in psychology from Brandeis, and then I did what any psychology major would do. I went into tech support. Because there's nothing you can do coming out of undergrad with a psychology degree. But I did tech support for SeaChange International, the video server company based out of Acton. And one day, I sat as a participant in a usability study. And I hear this a lot, that people kind of serendipitously get into the UX field, and that's exactly what happened with me. I have the psychology background, I'm a technology geek, and then I sat as a participant for a usability study. It was actually Bentley University who came in and did the study, and I said, what is this? I wound up quitting my job and going to Bentley for 2.5 years for an MBA and an MS in Human Factors and Information Design. Since then, I've been doing UX research for the past 8 years, and now I'm vice president at MadPow, where I lead the research team. We have 3 dedicated researchers, well, 4 including myself. Whereas a lot of agencies have their designers do their own research, we like to keep that independent. So we will do the research for the larger MadPow projects where the designers are designing something, but we also do swoop in, swoop out research where a client will hire us to evaluate something that they're putting together, and then we'll hand the recommendations over to the client for them to implement. So that's a little bit about me. So what are we talking about here today? Oh, and by the way, feel free to interrupt. Raise your hand if you have any questions as we go. I'm all for that. So what are we talking about today? Qualitative research. And what you're seeing here are different types of qualitative research, just as a reminder of the types of research we're talking about. In the upper left, you've got a focus group, which I tend to avoid because it's a little marketing-y and people influence each other. Not a big fan of focus groups. A one-on-one interview where we're just talking to one person. Yeah?
Sorry, what did you mean by marketing-y?
Focus groups typically concentrate, the question was, what did you mean by marketing-y? Focus groups tend to focus on the 4 Ps. So who should we sell this to, at what price, and where? And that's where it has a tradition in market research. And I think UX research is a little different. And we want to get that one, we want to focus in on that one person as opposed to having people influence each other in the room. So along those lines, one-on-one research is actually the majority of what my team does. At the beginning of a project, we will talk to users and stakeholders to find out what this product should be. How should it, what are their hopes and dreams? What are their wants and needs? User interviews are the best way to do that. We'll also go into people's homes. What you're looking at here is an ethnographic observation. This is one of the best ways to see how people use stuff because you're in their natural environment. When you're going to someone's home or someone's office, you can see how they interact with their environment and how that affects how they use whatever it is that you're investigating. I'll never forget going into a professor's office and watching him enter his grades into his old school spiral-bound grade book, into a spreadsheet that he used to track it, and his official school software. So he had to do it for 3 things. And I asked him, why did he put it in the book? He's like, yeah, I don't really need to, but it's just tradition, and I've always done it that way. I never would have seen that if we didn't do ethnographic observation. And then finally, a usability study, where we sit with a participant, a one-on-one session, and have them perform some tasks on an interface and find out what's working on the interface, what's not working on the interface, and have them think aloud while doing so that we're capturing as much qualitative information as possible. And what you're seeing in the lower left there is our lab in Boston. That's the MadPal lab, and me faking a user experience study, because this was a photo shoot. But what you were looking from the observation room into our lab. And we had the observation room and lab facilities over in by South Station. So digging in a little bit more into why we're talking about this, when we have a one-on-one conversation, when we're doing this qualitative research, we want to get the best possible information out of participants. And what do I mean by best possible? We want to get at those hopes and dreams, wants and needs, the things that are really going to make them either use the interface, find out what's going to make it as useful as possible, because the first step is making it useful, then we make it usable. And in order to get this information, we want users to be calm, cool, and comfortable, relaxed. When you have a participant in the lab, a researcher's number one goal, number one priority is the participant's comfort. Never mind the data, never mind the client. We're paying these people who have given us an hour of their time and want them to be comfortable. And that's what that's what part of this is about, using your voice to make people feel as comfortable as possible. So a relaxed participant is going to give you that useful data. They'll be more thoughtful and thinking about your questions. A person who is not relaxed is going to have their heart racing, and they're going to not think as much when they answer your question. They're going to give you just the surface answer. We don't want the surface answer. We want deeper answers. We want them to think about things. So we want people to be nice and calm and comfortable. And that's why the psychologist's voice is so important when conducting user experience research. So when we talk about user experience research, especially qualitative, and when we talk about the best practices, we typically deal with how to do it. What documentation do you need? What are the artifacts? What's the process in doing this? So all right, we talk about preparation, documentation, and technique. How do you do it? What documents do we need? How should you lay out your screener? How should you lay out your study guide? That's really important. We have to learn about asking non-leading questions or non-biased questions. Again, we don't want to lead the participant. We want to get the best possible data out of them. And then the different activities and different questions that we'll ask in order to get at different types of data. But this is the stuff that's talked about a lot in the UX community, in the user experience research community. But something that is not talked about is how to carry your voice. People may get moderation training if they go through a program such as Bentley or General Assembly or one of those. But we don't really talk about how to moderate. So, and we talk a little bit about asking unbiased questions, but we don't talk about how to modulate your voice. How do you talk to people in order to make them as comfortable as possible to get the best data possible out of the study? So what do I mean by the voice? There are different components to the voice. And these are all things that we should start being mindful of as we moderate more and more studies. The pace. How fast you talk. So if you start talking to a participant like this, they're not going to understand you, right? You got to talk nice and slower. You must, and I've seen people in the lab where they talk like this and they start talking much faster and the participant doesn't know what they're saying. We don't want that. You must talk a little slower. The power, where your voice is coming from. So we want your voice coming from your belly, because that's where your power is coming from. You don't want the voice coming from your head, because you're actually you may even it's harder to talk from your head. You want that power to come from your voice, from your abdomen. The volume with which you talk, you never want the participant to say what, and you don't want to overpower the participants. You have to be very conscious of volume. Emphasis, putting stress on those key words. When you're asking a question, pause after a key word, or give emphasis, like I just did to the word emphasis, to the key word, so that you make sure that they're answering the question that you want. Where you stop for emphasis, the pitch with which you talk, and then the ups and downs of your sentences. No one wants to hear someone talking monotone, because they're going to fall asleep. Again, we want people to be engaged and interested. So if you're talking monotone in a very soft voice, they're not going to be engaged. So always have that inflection. But of course, there are no easy answers to controlling your voice. Some people say that you should match the participant's voice when you are moderating a session. So they're talking fast, you start talking fast a little bit. I'm not a fan of that. It can be very unnatural for moderators, and we want to be as natural as possible when we're sitting in the room with participants. So you want to be natural, and also if you do this incorrectly, participants may think that you're mocking them, because you're going to try to mimic the way that they're talking. And if you don't do that gracefully, then they're going to think something is up and it's a little weird, and then they're going to get uncomfortable, and then we don't want that. Other people say just be yourself. Just do what you normally would do when you get into the room with participants. Again, we don't pay enough attention to how we speak. So if you're just being yourself, chances are you're not being mindful of your voice and how you think and how you're talking. So yourself may be this booming, intimidating voice, or a meek voice that doesn't command authority. Being yourself may not necessarily work. So we need to find a happy medium between the two. So that's what the psychologist voice comes in. So who here has heard of Dr. Bruce Serkin? Anyone? No, I didn't think so. Okay, oh, cheating, okay. So Dr. Bruce Serkin was the school psychologist at Bethpage High School, where I grew up, on Long Island. And in high school, I took part in this group session with Dr. Serkin. Some of my friends were a little troubled, and I was the token good guy. And we got these group sessions together. We did them for a number of months. And then one day, I walked into Dr. Serkin's office and sat down, and his voice was completely different. He was now talking like this. He was talking much more modulated, softer, a slower pace. He was obviously being a lot more mindful about how he was talking. You can see how my voice has changed from what I was just doing. For the past couple of slides, I was animated Dan, animated presenting Dan. But now I put on my psychologist voice. I'm talking slower, I'm talking modulated. You can all understand me very well. And he said, I've put on my psychologist voice. I'm sorry, Dr. Serkin said, I'm practicing my psychologist voice. So he was early on in his career. And that's why he was a school psychologist. He eventually moved on to have his own practice. And it was that time where his voice just changed. And I'll never forget that. And that psychologist voice is what I have brought to the lab. And I think it has elicited some great data, because we put on this voice, participants are nice and comfortable, they can understand me, and they're not going to get agitated, and I don't want their heart racing if I'm talking like this. So that's where the psychologist voice came from. So how does that affect the components of your voice? All right, so pace. I'm talking at a much more even, calm pace than I was earlier in the presentation. The power is coming from my belly. I am using my abdomen and diaphragm in order to talk to you guys. Volume is audible, but not too loud and not too low. Right in the middle. We want to be conscious of all of these things so that we get that great data. Stressing the important words, and these are the things we talked about earlier. Emphasizing key points with pauses. Pause is a very underrated voice component. A lot of people will just go and start talking, But every now and again, it's good to pause and emphasize what you had just said by pausing. It allows the participant to take a moment just to think about what you said. And they're going to process what you just said. And then you can notice that on their face and again keep going. So pauses are very underrated. Depth. You want to be comfortable where you're talking. I've heard some folks who said, "Oh, I'm trying to speak in a lower voice so that I don't sound the way I normally do." But we do want you to be comfortable. So talk at a depth where you're comfortable. Otherwise, you're not going to be comfortable in talking. You're going to be concentrating on your depth and forgetting about your volume and emphasis and so forth. And then the inflection. Again, not monotone. I've seen a number of moderators go into a lab where they're just talking monotone and there's no inflection in their voice and they're just talking at the participant. That's not the way to go. It's all about having that inflection in your voice, keeping the participant interested so that they are listening to your questions and giving you great data. So moving on from the voice, there's also nonverbal communication. And so this is a graph that I just found on the internet. I don't know exactly what it means, but I agree with it. Where the tone of voice is everything we've been talking about so far, right? And that's part of communication. What we say is part of it as well, but nonverbal communication is huge. We don't think about it nearly enough. How do we express ourselves with our body? Our posture, the way we lean in, the distance between the participant and the moderator. And you have to judge the comfort level that the participant has with the distance between you and the participant. Sometimes they like to get really close, and even if that's uncomfortable for you, you stay very close. Maybe some participants, they tend to take a step back. Even when you greet them in the waiting room, you shake their hand and they take a step back. It's like, all right, this person needs a little bit more room. So if we're mindful of this nonverbal communication, we can have much better interactions with our participants. And nonverbal communication is typically involuntary. So it's much harder to control. So just as I'm saying that you should be mindful of your voice and how you modulate your voice and everything I've talked about, that's usually unconscious as well. So now I'm piling something else on top of that, nonverbal communication. So pair your psychologist voice with mindful nonverbal communication, and you're going to have great interactions with your participants. And your nonverbal communication really sets the stage for the subsequent words. You're going to have this. You're going to have an interaction with the participant without saying any words quite yet by the way that you look at them, by looking at them in the eyes, giving that right distance, raising your eyebrows if they say something interesting. Or even if they don't say something interesting, raising your eyebrows will make them think that they have said something interesting. And that keeps them talking, right? So, and similar with taking notes. So if I'm taking notes, either handwritten or typing, never stop taking notes because the participant's going to think that what they're saying is no longer interesting or important. So again, even if they're rambling on a little bit, but still within the realm of the things we want to talk about, just keep typing or just keep writing, and I'll even sometimes just draw a line on my piece of paper to make them think I'm taking notes. But that keeps them talking, right? And that's what this is all about, keeping participants talking so that we can collect great qualitative data to inform designs. So what are the components of nonverbal communication? Well, posture. So don't slouch when you're sitting in the chair with the participant in the room, because that's going to show disinterest. And plus, the moderator is the person in control in the lab. If you're slouching in the lab, you're losing control. You're not showing your authority of being the moderator there. Facial expressions should be appropriately responsive. Some people like to keep just very deadpan in the lab. No, that's not a natural interaction that we have with people. We want to have good facial expressions, and as I just said with the eyebrow raising, show interest with your facial expressions. Never show displeasure. Never show displeasure to a participant, because that's going to shut them up right away. The distance we've already talked about a little bit, where we want to keep that optimal distance based on how you've already judged the participant's comfort level with distance. And you can usually do that when you greet them in the waiting room. You want to keep a nice conversational tone. You don't want to have this academic monotone tone where, all right, now tell me about this. No, we want to keep it a conversation. And that's the most important thing about qualitative research is that we always want to have a conversation. A study guide is just that. It's a guide. It'll point us to the questions that we don't want to forget about, but we should be able to skip around and have that conversation with participants. So if they mention something that's coming later, we should be nimble enough to be able to talk to that and then come back to where we were. So keeping it a conversation is very helpful in the lab. Body movements, so facing the participant squarely. Don't turn off to the side. Again, that's showing disinterest. We want to face them squarely. And lean in where appropriate. Oh, they're saying something interesting. Or they're not saying something interesting, but want them to keep talking. So keep mindful of your body movements. And your mannerisms. Something that we're very unconscious of are our own mannerisms. Whether it is just tapping on your clipboard or like clicking your pen or spinning. I spin a pen like crazy, but it's very distracting to participants, so I don't do that in the lab. So be very mindful of your own mannerisms so that you're keeping the participant as comfortable as possible. You don't want to freak them out. And saying all this, I'm not saying that you need to be the stereotypical 1950s psychotherapist, as it was in Mad Men here. The stereotypical 1950s psychotherapist is that overly evenly toned, asking obtuse questions and just keeping the person talking to a point. But there are some things that we can learn from this. We can still show emotion. They don't really show emotion here. Actually, yeah, so we can show emotion. We should convey that we're empathizing with the participant, that we understand where they're coming from. And we don't have to be their friend, but we want to be their confidant. We want them to feel comfortable telling us maybe even some of their deepest thoughts. We do a lot of healthcare work at MadPow, and we have a lot of uncomfortable conversations. I've talked to cancer patients and AIDS patients and pregnant women who have had troubles with their pregnancy. Very tough conversations. But again, I don't need to be their friend, but I can be a really good confidant, a good listener. But what can we take away from the stereotypical 1950s psychotherapist? First off, listening. Listening to listen and understand. So listening to listen, that's maybe a novel concept there, but often we're just listening just to please the person that's talking. It goes whoop, one out in ear, one out the other sometimes. Conscious listening is very important when you're in the lab with participants. Asking why multiple times, and not like a petulant child. Why? Why do you feel this? Oh, that's interesting. Why do you feel that? There are different ways of doing that. Tell me more about that. Tell me how you feel about that. Why did you do that? Or why do you feel that way? So there are different ways of asking why. And there's a great technique that we often use called laddering, where, all right, the participant gives us an answer, and we want to ask why at least 3, 4, 5 times so that we're getting to the root cause of the problem. And so asking why, but not using the word why when you can avoid it. Turning questions back onto the participants. This one comes with a little finesse because we don't want the participant to feel that we're being cagey and not answering their questions. We will answer all their questions in the end, but we want to keep them talking, right? And we want to hear how they think about the question that they just asked. So the participant asks a question, well, what does this button do? Well, what do you think that button does? And then they click it and they react to it. Or what information would this have? Well, what information do you think it should have? So always turn questions back to participants, but always answer their questions as best you can, because that's going to build that trust that you need with your participants. Confirming that you understood them correctly. You just said X because of Y. Did I understand that correctly? This is very important when we're dealing with something complex, and we want to make sure that our notes are indeed correct. So a participant says something complex. I kind of lose it mid-sentence while I'm taking notes. Okay, let's reconfirm that. Very important. And keeping quiet. This one can be really tough for folks, especially for extroverts. Keeping quiet is not natural. We, as humans, don't like silence. And when you're in the room with a participant, it can be a little uncomfortable. But you know what? You need that discomfort because the participant's going to be uncomfortable and they're going to fill the gap with words. And we like words in the lab when they're coming from the participant. So keep silent, let the participant fill that silence. And never convey that, and you should always be conveying that there are no wrong answers. You can say that explicitly at the beginning of the session. There are no wrong answers today. Just tell me what you think. So along those lines, though, in terms of how you're conveying this, never sound disappointed when you're talking to a participant. Oh, okay. No, you don't want to do that. That's great, thank you. Always be interested in what they say. Never daydream. Never let your mind wander, which can be really tough sometimes when you're moderating and they're just kind of figuring something out on the screen and they're kind of going all around and your mind is just saying click it, click it, click it. But always be interested in what they say. And then convey that the participant is always the expert. They are the expert in the domain that we're talking about. When I was talking with AIDS patients, I don't know anything about being an AIDS patient. They are the expert about that. So I need to learn what their hopes and dreams are for this thing that we're working on. And this can also be useful outside of the lab. So voice mindfulness, everything I've been talking about so far is in the lab. But let's take a step out of the lab. This can be very useful in our day-to-day interactions with coworkers, with spouses even, or strangers that we meet on the street. It could be used for difficult conversations where you're having a contentious conversation or an uncomfortable conversation and you get all heated and you start maybe even like raising your voice a little bit. You put that voice mindfulness on, you're going to be a lot calmer, and hopefully you can convey calmness to the person that you're talking to. So you can use this outside of the lab as well. And we talk all day long without thinking about our voice. If we start thinking about our voice a little bit, we may be able to improve the conversations that we have. So what do I mean by this? So mindfulness is active attention to the thing that we're talking about. So voice mindfulness is active attention to your own voice as you're talking, whether it's in the lab, whether it's in a meeting with coworkers, whether it's over the dinner table. And I actually did a search for voice mindfulness, and there's not much out there. People aren't really thinking about this. There are people talking about how to carry your voice in general, but the idea of just thinking about your voice actively as best you can is fairly new. And I challenge everyone in this room to practice voice mindfulness. Again, not overly, because you don't want it to sound unnatural, because the other person may think, well, what's going on here? This is a little weird. But there are ways to do that without being overly, to make it feel uncomfortable, to make it feel unnatural. And all of this is unconscious, so we need to become a little bit more conscious about the things that we're doing. Again, the nonverbal communication that's normally unconscious, and the voice that's normally unconscious. Being more mindful of both of these will help make us better researchers and maybe even have better conversations outside the lab. And then practice. So this presentation is a great practice for me, but go out there and start practicing your voice mindfulness. So all in all, the psychologist's voice that I've been talking about is voice mindfulness. It's thinking about how we're talking so that you can put the participants at ease and get great qualitative data. I mentioned that I work for MadPow. I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you all about MadPow and mention that we are an experienced design agency, full service from research up front to development on the end and everything in between. So experience design, visual design, content strategy, digital marketing, what did I miss there? Strategy and behavior change. We have behavior change practice. So I work for an agency, so if you guys are interested in any of our work, happy to give a card and talk to you about that. And with that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Dan. Is there questions from the audience?
Right there.
So you said at the beginning that you separate roles at MadPow between designer and researcher. And I'm curious why you do that.
So all the researchers in our team are trained researchers, formally trained researchers, and it's a philosophy that a designer or someone who's very embroiled in their own design may get a little biased in that I designed it this way because I expect users are going to use it that way. But then we take that out. We have this neutral third party now. I, as a researcher, have no idea why it was designed in the way it was designed, and now I'm going to listen to the user to really understand how the user is going to use it, and I'm not going to be biased in the evolution of that design. Any other questions?
Yeah, so earlier you said, you mentioned that you should never show a displeasure face. But you also mentioned that you deal with some sensitive topics and uncomfortable situations. Is there ever a time where you break that rule?
Only if I'm sympathizing with a participant. If they say something that is, egregiously bad that happened to them, yeah, I'll give a grimace so that they know that I'm sympathizing with what they're talking about. But if they say something that's just their opinion and I grimace, that's a different story.
Thanks. I have two comments. The first one is when you were talking about gestures or facial expressions, I also think it's interesting to keep in mind that a lot of that is culturally based and socially constructed.
Absolutely.
For example, I come from a Greek background, and the no, the gesture for no is this. It's completely, it's like, so, there are other gestures I know that are culturally, like the raised eyebrows. I have an Ethiopian adopted kid, and raised eyebrows means yes.
So along those lines, that's why it's really important to run research in the location where the people are going to be using this. We actually partner with researchers around the world. We're part of the International User Experience Partnership, if you look that up online. If a client comes to us and says, we want to run research in the US, Germany, and India, we have partners around who will go and do it. We're not going to go and do it because what do I know about running research in India, right?
Yeah.
I'm not part of that culture. Similarly, here, maybe even in America, this one's a little, slightly different, but conducting research with folks that are like you. So I don't know where I was going with that. I lost my train of thought there. But keeping
I'll
it
keep you
culturally
talking.
sensitive.
Okay.
Yeah, and yeah.
The other comment I had is I'm a soon-to-be retired Boston Public School teacher, yay, and looking to go in some different directions. That's why I've been coming to these interesting meetups. I've worked with a lot of populations of kids who come from traumatic backgrounds. And the voice mindfulness, which just sort of on a personal basis that I have come to practice the past maybe 5 years, I could not agree with you anymore that just being aware of my voice, and it does take practice and training, and not being reactive but just more responsive, or just really taking my voice down a notch, has made just gigantic.
Great.
And I wish you would do some sorts of training, and I noticed you pointed to high school, but in the public schools, because I think it would be a really good benefit.
Excellent. And you make a great point there about being reactive. We're always just reactive. And that's part of this, is being mindful about your own reactiveness so that you can modulate that to remain appropriate.
Cool. I have a question, which is, how would you know if you are improving in your voice mindfulness? Like, is there any way we could measure or know or track if we're doing better or being more mindful or being successful in that way?
That's a great question. I have no idea. Actually, okay. A very good and hard practice for a qualitative researcher is to watch yourself on video. That's the best way that you're going to critique your own performance in there. You'll pick up on, oh, I should have asked a probing question here. I got to be more mindful of that. Oh, I raised my voice a little bit here. That was weird. So I don't think there's a quantitative way of doing that. But I think over time, if you watch your videos, you should see an increase in that voice mindfulness.
So understanding how people are communicating with you seems to be key to this. Do you have any training sources, any way of understanding nonverbal, other people's voices, things like that?
Not specifically. It really just comes with the experience of having so many people come through the lab and understanding people a little bit. So maybe the training is the psychological training of how people operate. I don't know of any formal training for nonverbal communication, unfortunately. But maybe just understanding people is really the key.
Hello, it's been a great presentation. It's so nice to be here. I have a question, but I have to make the introduction. We are from Chile, South America, right? And we are here to validate a device they have developed as academic entrepreneurs. So I was thinking that what you're saying is great for us, and I'm crossing that with the cultural barriers that you can find. So I was thinking for us, meeting people, we might misread some of their I mean, we can use all the theory that you explained, which is like what we do back at home, but perhaps what an American would react would be different than what we would expect them to react. So what would be your advice, like your tips for us to besides what we can do, which is having an American person, a Native American person going with us to the meetings, what other would you recommend?
Right. Well, that is the easiest way is to have an American come with you and read that for you. Whew, that's a good question. It's almost like educating yourself on cultural norms, on the weird things that Americans do when we react to things, or even looking at norms across different cultures so that you can start picking up on those when they happen in the lab, right? So you can start noticing them, and instead of being reactive to them, note it in your mind, all right, they had this reaction. I need to go back and investigate what that was really all about. So even in the beginning, maybe even if you don't have an American come into the meetings with you, just sitting in the observation room and offering just some insights as to, oh, this person seems to have this reaction. But it's probably education on cultural norms is the short answer.
I have a question. So I think it's very interesting that you brought in the therapist kind of an analogy there while you were conducting user research. I personally found there were moments that when especially in more like explorative user research where like you're not like validating too much, you're just trying to understand the other person's word. When you're too like calm and like really like showing very accommodating, sometimes the other person might really took me as a therapist and start to like talk like ramble and to talk a lot about their problems and like it just to get derailed from like I have my agenda on my script. I have certain answers I'm looking for. But when a person get into that kind of counseling mode, they started to like just ramble and talk too much. I don't know, like, how do you deal with that situation? Like, try to bring it back to say that, oh, actually, this is not a therapist decision. So
stopping a rambling participant is one of the hardest things to do. when moderating a study, because it's rude, right? It's rude to stop a person from talking. And here we are asking people to tell us as much as possible, and then they're off in left field somewhere. Then you only have 1 hour with this participant, so you want that to be as efficient as possible. So the ways to deal with that are to acknowledge that which they're saying. Thank you for sharing with that. But I'd like to bring the conversation back to the original question, or maybe even bring it back to the interface. Say, okay, you know, that's interesting what you just told me. How does that relate to the thing that we were just looking at? So bring it back to your questions, bring it back to the interface. But that is the hardest thing to do, and because we want to be nice, and cutting someone off is not very nice, but you got to do what you got to do sometimes. You have a question back?
I have a question around how unpolished are the interfaces sometimes that you feel like are valuable to kind of use in a study or kind of have an subject actually kind of interface with, like how kind of dirty can things get?
As dirty as you want them. Paper prototyping is you can run a usability study, a traditional usability study with just some sketches using Post-it notes to say, all right, if you click this button and you put a Post-it note on, bam, that happens. All right, now tell me about how you think about that. So it doesn't need to be polished at all. Think about the project life cycle, where we go from formative research in the beginning to understand how this thing should work, to evaluative during the design to see if that which we are designing is intuitive, to summative at the end. All right, we have this fully baked thing. Can we release it? So in the formative stage, you can use paper prototyping or just an envision prototype, sketches. So you can do this with any fidelity interface.
I want just to comment on it that you don't necessarily even to need to have a prototype. You can, on the early stage, you can test even your competitors' websites or something like that, just to get an idea how people use stuff.
Actually, to piggyback on that, I love using words sometimes, very open-ended, few words, because I find that often as an interview technique, you get a lot of really good stuff about that. And it lets you ask questions in a way without leading too much. Mm-hmm. Like you're leading just like a little bit. So it really gives them breadth to, invent on their own, on the fly, so to speak, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and we don't want users designing for us, but they can at least give us some direction as to where they think it's going to go, and then as designers, we can mold it into something more fully baked.
Any more questions from the audience? Last question.
Hi. I wanted to ask you what you think about mimicking, because sometimes when you're interviewing someone, it's you get the advice of mimicking the other person's gestures, the other person's facial expressions or body language. Sometimes I think that's not very appropriate. I don't know what you think about that, because it seems like when you do that, you're closing the conversation on something that's very narrow, and you want the other person to be as broad as possible. What they're saying.
Yeah, as with anything in user experience, it depends. So mimicking is good for building maybe some initial rapport, where, all right, we want to show this person we're a little like them, but it can also get sometimes unnatural, where they will pick up on the mimicking, and they'll realize it's an unnatural situation and make them feel uncomfortable. So I'd say mimicking is important to a point. You want it to be like 5% of what you're dealing with. The rest of it should be everything we've been talking about.
Dan, for such an interesting presentation, and thank you all for coming to our lunchtime talk.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone. Good stuff.